I'm David Bollier. I've been a longtime scholar and activist of the Commons. I work with the Schumacher Center for New Economics in Western Massachusetts, and I work internationally with all sorts of different commoners on different projects. A lot of the principles of the Commons, I think, do have something to say to the fashion world. And in terms of the narratives no longer being credible, I mean, I think we're seeing this in many spaces of our life where capitalism can't deliver on the so-called progress that it was promising. The state has been more or less captured by capital, so that the brakes and controls and regulations on capitalist endeavors have, more or less disappeared. And I think a lot of us are alarmed by that, and then, worried about the inequality, the ecological destruction, climate change, volatile global supply chains. I think we all, at an intuitive level, realize that this cannot last, and we need to rethink how the industry works. So, I mean, that's sort of what I mean by the old narratives not being credible. And fashion as something that is so acutely attuned to culture and on the ground sensibilities has to adapt to this. It has to understand where people's heads and everyday lives are at. Well, let's start with the tragedy because that's where most people's heads are at. I mean, this was a famous essay in 1968 by biologist Garrett Hardin, who
Mm.
wrote an essay in the Science Journal called The Tragedy of the Commons. And he said, imagine you have a pasture and everyone can put as many sheep or cattle on it as they want. Nobody will have a rational motivation to hold back, and so they'll overexploit and ruin the shared resource. Well, this has been taken as a truism by economists and politicians and many others as a sign that the commons is a failure. The problem was that Hardin wasn't really describing a commons, he was describing a free-for-all or an open access regime. A commons has rules, it has governance, it has punishment for those who break the rules. In real life, that's in fact what happens. Neighbors or communities get together and say, oh, we're destroying something we all depend on. Let's put limits on it. And so the tragedy is really more, ironically enough, a description of free markets, which treats it as a free-for-all and take as much as you can. And the commons has been discredited in the popular mind, or certainly within free market capitalist minds, because they say, oh, only private property or the government can protect our shared resources. But in fact, commoners around the world in forest and farmlands and fisheries and irrigation water and wild game successfully, sustainably manage their shared wealth. It's time, I think, to acknowledge and honor the commons and give it support as a separate sector of meeting needs. I mean, I think the fair trade movement has done heroic work within the constraints it faces in trying to develop more sustainable sourcing methods to reduce waste, to engage with people in a more partnership arrangement with designers in the global south, for example. But I think that a lot of people understand that there are certain limits to what you can do when the whole system is arrayed
Yeah,
for cutthroat global market competition. And
totally.
you're voluntarily shouldering greater costs and burdens to try to achieve those goals. So I think there's some understandable frustration that, yes, you may be able to carve out a brand niche. Maybe you can improve this process and that process. And I don't mean to denigrate those things because I think those are important attempts to change how the industry works. It's not just critiquing the system, though, it's building the alternatives, which,
Yeah.
that takes a lot of risk taking, bravery, money, sweat equity, and coordination. But I think there are models out there that are happening throughout different theaters of action in the commons verse, as I call it, in that, this kind of cross-fertilization, co-learning from each other, that needs to be accelerated because we're not going to just pluck an answer out of the air. We need to create and invent these things with other people who intimately know how that article of clothing, how that textile is grown. Let's amplify those. Let's horizontally connect them. Let's have conferences like this that validate these alternatives and give them visibility. I think that's the conditions we need to help incubate a new fashion ecosystem.